Okay, so I think we're just about on time to start with today's session. I can see there's a couple more people joining. So welcome everyone to today's session, which is getting started with Power BI. I will be your moderator and host for today's session. And I work at the Microsoft Reactor in London as the event planner there. Our speaker for today is Chris Barber. Chris is a senior Power BI consultant with Altius, and we're very lucky to have him delivering today's session. It will be a hands-on workshop, so there's some links that have already been shared in the Q&A section, which you will be able to use for today's workshop. We do welcome any questions throughout today's session that I will be moderating and will be sharing into the published feed. So any questions you have at all today, please feel free to drop them in there and we'll make sure they get answered before the end of today. And just a heads up that this session is also being recorded. So the recording will be available on the Reactor YouTube channel within about 48 hours of the session ending. So without further ado, Chris, I will hand it over to you to begin.
Thank you very much, Emma, and welcome everybody to today's session with the Microsoft Reactor. Real pleasure to be with you here today. So today is a kind of a gentle introduction to Power BI itself if you've not used the product before. And what we'll be doing is we'll be going through the product itself, looking at the Power BI desktop and Power BI service, and then we'll be looking at a specific data set and then running through our first set of visualizations. Now, I really hope everybody can see my screen, but please let me know in the chat if you cannot. There are two files that will be important for you today, so you can download all the files for today's session from the file location that I put up. And you can also download Power BI Desktop. I hope everybody's already got it downloaded, but you will need that for today's session because it's very hands-on. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go over to Power BI Desktop, and hopefully some of you have already managed to open it up. And I'm just going to give you a quick kind of breakdown about what we kind of can see here within the desktop version. So there's two sort of main versions of Power BI. There's Power BI Desktop, which is here, which is where you do all your kind of work in preparing your model, and if you're developing the model, this is where you will be, and then you will publish it up to the Power BI service, and that's like an online cloud-based service where your users will consume your reports, but obviously there's a mobile version as well, so users can consume it that way as well. But again, that works off of the Power BI service. So hopefully those of you who have managed to open it up and recognize that this is quite similar to what you'll see within most other Microsoft products. So across the top, we have this ribbon, which is very much like what you will see within Word or within Excel or within PowerPoint. So this is very much your standard navigation that Microsoft offers. On our right-hand side here, we've also got filters. So when we start importing data, we'll be able to filter our data differently. And you'll notice there we've got filters on the page and filters across the report. So you can filter different ways as well, and we can add different pages to your report and you can filter those differently. And just the third thing I want to draw your attention to is we've got a list of all of our visualizations here on the right hand side, and there's lots of different visualizations that you can use within Power BI, so line charts, bar charts, scatter plots, all these kind of things. But there's also a marketplace and you can download a whole host of other visuals that people have built themselves. So it's Microsoft allow people to build and add in visuals, and you can also access those as well. Okay, so I'm just going to sort of introduce today's data set, and then what we'll do is we'll start actually building that out. So today's data set, in fact, if I show you the online version. So today's data set is the iris data set, and it's a classification problem. So we're looking at 3 different types of flowers, and then we're classifying them into based on we've got a whole bunch of characteristics about the data. And this is kind of a relatively standard problem that we see. In fact, I dealt with this in my master's actually years ago. So if you go to the CSV file and you open up the file that we've got today, you should hopefully see this set of data. So we've got our observations. So there's 150 observations within this data set. We've then got sepal length, width, and the length of the petal, and the width of the petal. And then we've got the classification of which of the species it is. So that's today's data set that we're going to be working with. And we're going to be importing this into our Power BI desktop model, and then we're going to be manipulating that data. So I'm just going to close that down for now, because I actually don't need to do anything with it. And I'm going to first of all start by importing the data into Power BI. So the way we get data into Power BI is we use this Get Data button up here at the top. Hopefully everybody can see that. Change the color. So we've got the Get Data. And within Power BI, there's a whole host of different ways that you can connect to the data. And you can see here, there's a few options down here. If you go to more, you can actually see there's a whole plethora of different ways that you can connect to your data. And here's a list of all of them. So if you've got SQL Server or you've got other things within your organization, you can connect to it. Today, we're going to be using a text stroke CSV file. So if you click on text CSV and go connect, and then what you'll have to do is you have to navigate to wherever you have the files for today saved. So if you navigate to where you've got the files today saved, there will be a CSV file called iris data. And if you just double click on that, now what you're doing is you're now bringing that data from the CSV into your Power BI desktop. And the first thing you see when you do that is you see this data preview. And Power BI always does this regardless of what data type you try and connect to. So what it does is it gives you a kind of a preview based on an initial subset. So in this case, the first 200 rows of the data, just so you can look at the data and kind of feel whether it looked right to you before you begin importing it. And this is quite important when you start dealing with larger data sets. So if you're dealing with data set of 1 million rows, you don't want to go load it in and then realize you've got a problem, because it'll take time to load all that in. Whereas if you have a preview, it gives you a chance to look at the information. So we're relatively happy with this data, and we could just load this straight into our model and start creating our visuals and stuff like that. However, generally, we always advise people firstly to go into transform data. And what that does is that opens up what's known as the query editor. And this query editor is consistent across Microsoft products. So it's available in the cloud. It's also available in Excel. So if you've ever used the query editor within Excel, you'll see a very similar experience within Power BI. It's got a few more advanced features, but it's a very similar look and feel. And you can do a lot of the same transformations, and the same underlying programming language sits behind it. So if we go transform our data, we will get this secondary, as I mentioned, query editor come up. Now yours probably won't look like this when you do it if you're following along with the session, but what you can do is across the top here, again, you've got a ribbon. If you go to view and you add in column distribution, you'll get these distribution columns that I've already got. It's a really good idea to have that turned on because it gives you an idea of what your data's like before you start dealing with it. I'd also advise that you turn on the formula bar, but that's a bit more optional. You don't necessarily have to do anything with the formula bar now, but it's quite useful to have it on as you kind of learn a little bit by osmosis, kind of what's going on in the background every time you transform your data. And as you get more advanced in your journey, what you'll find is you'll start editing things directly in the formula bar rather than editing them through the step process that you can do here. Okay, so we can see quite clearly our observations. We've got 150 unique values in here. Whereas if we look at our species, we've got our 3 distinct different types of flowers that we've got here. So we've got 150 rows, we've got 3 distinct types. And we could now begin to kind of transform and clean our data, especially if you get messy data. This is really, really useful to go ahead and start cleaning your data. So if you've got the same data transformation you do every day, so I receive the same Excel file every day, I do the same things with it. I delete columns, I add columns. Doing it within the query editor, what you'll find is it will automate that process for you. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're just going to load this in. We're not actually going to change anything. Just before we do load anything in, I'm just going to point out a couple of things that Power BI has done automatically for us. So we connected to a source here on the right hand side. Power BI has added 2 additional steps, which is to promote headers and to change type. And we can click through and see those. So if you look originally, it didn't have the headers were on the first line of data, not within our headers themselves. Power BI has promoted the headers. It's recognized that they're headers. And along here, it's recognized currently that every data type is the same. And Power BI has changed those data types. So these 1s and 2s here are indicating that we're dealing with a number rather than dealing with text. And the ABC, similarly here, indicates we're dealing with text. And the 1, 2, 3 is a slightly different one. It is saying we're dealing with a whole number rather than a decimal number. Okay, so we're now going to go across to home and we're going to go close and apply. And that's going to bring our data into our model for us to start doing our first visualization with. Okay, and now because we're only dealing with 150 rows, it's going to be very quick. Obviously, the larger the volumes of data you're dealing with, it will take longer. But that's obviously just brought it through straight away. And what we've got now on the right hand side, I can just bring up my colors. On the right side, we've now got our data there. It wasn't there available before in the fields. And you can see it's got the iris data and it's got all of the different fields that we were looking at. Okay, and we can actually look at this in a bit more detail. So we're currently on the visualization pane here, but we've also got a table view here where we can look at the data. And this is very much more like your standard, what you'd look like in Excel. So if we click at the table and select our iris data here on the right hand side, there you have a table of the data that we're dealing with, and you can look at all of the records that are loaded into the model just by scrolling up and down. The third tab is a data modeling tab. This is a bit more of an advanced topic, but really Power BI is seen by a lot of people when they first go to it as a visualization tool. In fact, what you learn over time is that a lot of the power within Power BI is actually in the data modeling. And there are some great examples out there, like the billion rows of data that are loaded into New York Taxi. And that shows a really interesting report. And that's all because of the power of data modeling and being able to deal with those sort of volumes of data. Okay, so we're going to go back to our visualization and we're going to create our first visual. And it's going to be relatively straightforward to start with. And then we can do a little bit more with it and we can play around with the formatting. Okay, so the visual that we're going to start with is going to be a scatter plot, which is just here, which I've just highlighted on the screen. And if you click your scatter plot, you'll see that you get this visual appear on the pane near the top left-hand corner. What you'll also see is you've now got a list of fields that you can then add into this visual. So we can add in details, legend, things on the X axis, things on the Y axis, things to determine the size, etc. And what we can now do is we can drag our fields from our fields across to our details and start to populate our report. So drag from one to the other, and that will start to create visuals on the page. So what we'll first do is we're going to use our species and our legend. And the reason we're going to do that is because we're going to want to classify and show different colors for our 3 different types of species here on the screen. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the petal length on the X-axis and the petal width on the Y-axis. Okay, and I'm just going to make this a bit bigger. So I've just used the standard kind of as you would in PowerPoint. And a lot of what the Power BI team talk about is about making Power BI PowerPoint for data. So they're trying to make it as user-friendly as possible. So it's literally just a drag to expand the size of your visual. Now, currently, we've only got 3 data points on our in our visual, which isn't very helpful. We know we've got 150 records. So what we want to do is we want to change so that we're actually seeing all of those 150 points so we can start to look at the data. And the way that we do that is if we go over to petal length here and we hit the down arrow just here, we can see that by default, Power BI has decided that we want to sum our data. And it's made that decision based upon the type of data it is, but you can also change that behavior as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to change that behavior from a sum to don't summarize, and then we're going to do exactly the same with the petal width on the y-axis. So don't summarize. Okay, so we've now got all of our different data points here within our visual. And we can see, it's not the prettiest visual at this point, and we can do more with the formatting, but we can see that by using just petal length and petal width, we can discriminate between these three different types of flowers and figure out which one is which to a certain extent. So if we look down here, Setosa, we can tell, tends to have a lower length and a lower width, and we can discriminate those out. However, with the other two, there's a bit more of an overlap between them, and it's going to be a bit harder to distinguish. We've got this bit of overlap here, but we can still clearly see that we've got sort of two distinct different clusters. We've also got sort of a few problems with this visual that I want to change. So first of all, we've got some points which are on the edges here, so we can change the axis to just make sure that they all show within the visual. And that's what we're going to start off with doing now, is we're going to start looking at some of the formatting options that you could do to improve this visual and to make it look a little bit more sort of user friendly. And the way we do that is with the visual highlighted, and you need to make sure it's selected, you go over here and there is this formatting option just down here. And once you select formatting option, you get quite an extensive list of different formatting options that you can choose, and you'll realize just how many different ways when you play around with this yourself that you can make your visual, different ways you can play and change your visual, and there's lots of different things you can do. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the x-axis, so the x-axis being this axis. Now, obviously, continuous is the type that we want it to be, right? We're not looking at categorical data here. If we had the species on the x-axis, that would be a categorical set of data, but we do want continuous. So that's all correctly identified. And I'm just going to change this start point to minus 0.1. And I'm just going to change the end point on the x-axis to 7. And it's just going to make all my visuals kind of fit a bit nicer on the page. And I'm going to do exactly the same now with the y-axis. So with the y-axis, and you just click on this just to make it go down. Just change the auto, so the auto is fine as 0, and then we can make that up to 3. There we go. So we've now got all of our points a bit clearer within our range. Okay, so I'm just going to close that y-axis back up again now. And now we're going to look at the different types of shapes. So at the moment, we're distinguishing between the 3 different types based on the color, which is fine. And you can change those colors here to make them something that you might feel a bit more comfortable with. So if I change the color here to yellow, you'll see here Setosa has changed to yellow. Right. Okay, so now what we can do is, by looking at the shapes, that's really helpful, especially when we're dealing with people who are potentially colorblind. We want to be really careful with our reports, and sometimes we have to consider this, and there are actually colorblind checkers that you can push your reports through. And one of the ways we can do that is by adjusting the shapes. So we have here as a default the size, and you can see if I drag that, the size gets bigger or smaller of the dots. And let's keep it around there. We've also got this marker shape as well, so we can have different marker shapes. But what we can do is we can choose to customize each individual series. So with Setosa, I can use the circle, but I can go down here and I can change so that we're using squares instead. And I can use triangles, for instance. So I can distinguish between the 3 different types by shape as well as by color. All right, and that's one of the many formatting options that you can have available to you within Power BI. Okay, and I think one of the things that we'll do today is, when you hopefully get the file open and you load the data in yourself, if you haven't already, is to start playing around with and get comfortable with all the different options and different formatting settings you've got. I'm not going to run through each and every one because there's a huge list. I think one of the other important ones to point out, though, is the title. So the title at the moment is sort of left justified up here in the corner. one of the things that's quite nice to be able to do is to make that title a little bit clearer for everybody. And the way we go about doing that is we can change the background color. So I'm going to choose, let's put it in yellow, and I can center. So I'm doing that all down here on the right hand side. Change the alignment, and I can change the text size. And there you go. That's kind of a bit clearer now what it is exactly that we're looking at. So that's kind of one visual that would be good for you to kind of start by building out and having a go at. And don't just follow the kind of the formatting options that I've shown. Choose your own, play around with it, and see if you can find something that you think is sort of visually appealing for what you want to achieve. The second thing I'm going to look at is I'm going to introduce a secondary visual into this report. In sort of one of the powers of Power BI is that by introducing multiple visuals, you can then alter the behavior between those different visuals. So if a user interacts with one of the visuals, the other visual will change as well. And that's really kind of a neat kind of thing that just happens automatically. So if you were going to go and do that within a programming language, you'd have to kind of write all that yourself. Okay, so the secondary visual that we're going to bring in is going to be, let's use the Q&A visual here. Okay, and the Q&A visual is a really interesting visual because it allows you just to ask a question of your data and it will give you the output. So if I go count species, there you go, it's just going to return just the number 3, right? It's decided the best visual, and this is what's called a card visual, and this is the best way to show the data to me. If we were to look for something else, so if we went, for example, the average of the sepal length, we'll get the average again, that's a card visual. And if you look, in fact, let's not do sepal, let's do petal length because that's what we've got in our visual on the right hand side. So let's do average of the petal length, which is 3.76. Oh, do that, which is just around here somewhere, which kind of makes sense. But if we do that by species, hopefully it will decide to show us a different visual. There we go. So now that I've put by species, it knows that species is a categorical set of data. So what it's done is it's put my data into 3 different categories, and you can see 3 different categories that we've got here. And what I can now do is I can highlight each of these individual visuals and it will change the visual here on the left hand side. Conversely, I can also select points on this visual here on the left hand side and it will affect my visual on the right hand side. So let's start off just by clicking, and you can see now the other data points have all disappeared from the visual and I only have those data points there available, and the same applies if I click through. Okay, and this is really useful if I'm doing some exploratory analysis. If I publish this data up for my other users to use, they can then interact and kind of gather their own insights from that data. Okay, and similarly, if I select a point here on the left hand side, you can see, in fact, I'm going to select a different one just to make it a bit more obvious. There we go. Okay, so I've selected a point here on the left hand side. And what this is now showing me is this is showing a slightly different behavior. It's kind of grayed out this bar and this bar. And it's kind of just showing you that one point here within the visual. And it's basically saying that I've selected one which is higher than the average. So this point is at 5, which looks about right on the chart. But the average is 4.26. And I've got these tooltips here I can expect just by hovering my mouse over the top of it. Okay, so that's one kind of way we can look at the data. What we're now going to do is we are going to duplicate that page and we're going to use an algorithm to see if our data can be classified automatically and see how good Power BI is at doing that classification. Okay, and what I could do is I could build this page up from scratch, and I could do that, you know, just by clicking this plus bar here, creating a new page, and then just recreate my visuals. But I can also kind of just standardly just right click on my page number and select duplicate page, and I've now got 2 copies, page 1 and duplicate of page 1. It's pretty standard, as with most Microsoft products. I can just right click here and I can rename this, and I'm just going to call this cluster. And I'm now going to try and use an algorithm to try and classify this data for me automatically. So at the moment, I've provided it with which species it should belong to, but it'd be nice to see if the data points can be identified automatically. So I've just deleted that. In fact, I'm sorry, I did that a little bit quickly. So I'll just go back. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take that species out of the data set by hitting on the crest bar. And now you'll see that we've only got just that one color because we haven't got the legend available anymore. We can still use this bar chart, our column charting, just to slice between our data. And what we're going to do is we're just going to change this over. So I'm going to put the observations, and I just need to go back to the fields. I'm going to put the observations in the details because the observations contains the 150 rows of data that we've got. And as you can see, that's actually created my visual and caused it to crash. So what I can do now is, the reason it's crashing is because I'm not creating any, I've got 150 data points and I'm not summarizing them. But if I change them over to the sum of every single visual, there we go, it'll now bring it back together again. So I've now got my visual looking very similar as it did before. But what I can now do is, whenever Power BI has got these over every visual, you'll see these kind of across the top here. You'll see that these visual headers, that's what they're called. The visual headers across the top will appear when you hover over the visual. And there's this one that's got 3 dots. If we click on that 3 dots and then we go to automatically find clusters, what it's going to try and do is it's going to try and cluster those up into the buckets we define. So if we go automatically find clusters, it will bring up this dialog box. Now what we can do is we can let it automatically define how many clusters that we've got available, or we can let it know. Now I could automatically try and let it work it out, but I already know there's only 3 species that I'm looking for. So I'm going to see if the algorithm and how good a job it does at classifying the data. So if we click OK, we'll now see how good a job it's done. OK, so it's now created 3 clusters of the data. And if we look on our fields, it's put that within the legend for us automatically. And we can see and we can test out how good a job it's done. But we can see we've got the kind of the 3 distinct clusters that we were looking at before. Now, by using the kind of this visual on the right hand side, we can sort of investigate it. So if we click here, we can see that we've got about 100% hit rate for Setosa. They're all kind of correctly classified. However, if we select any of the other bars, what we'll see here is we've got some which are classified correctly and some which are incorrectly classified. So we can see these kind of 2 data points here haven't been able to classify correctly. And we can see here as well with Virginica that we've got 4 data points which are incorrectly classified. So that's another kind of way that you can use the visuals and you can use the kind of the automatic features within Power BI to help you out. Okay, so the final kind of little bit that I want to show you, actually what I'll do is I'll show you a table view of this data just so you can have a look at the classifications and how well they were done. So I'm just going to create a new page again. And we can just do a little check. And we're going to, this time, we're just going to introduce a table, which is just here. And we've got 2 kind of table-like visuals. If you think about this matrix one, like a pivot table in Excel, and this one here on the left is just like a normal table. So that's just what we can do actually. If I can just bring in the kind of pivot table one. And if we put the observations that it, so these are the clusters that it tried to put the data in for us across the rows, and we put the species across the top, and then we put the observations in the values. We then get a kind of a summary, and I'm just going to go into focus mode here, which will expand the visual to the whole page. That's just done by hovering and clicking on focus mode. Okay, and I'm just going to zoom in a little bit as well, actually, just to make it a bit easier. So we can now see, as mentioned, the Setosa was classified correctly. In fact, I shouldn't be using sum here. That's bad practice. It's not observations. We shouldn't be using sum because we should be using count. And the reason for that, so there's 150 records in our data. If I just go to our data view here on the left-hand side, our observations, there's 150 observations. Actually summing these makes absolutely no sense in terms of our data because these are just designed to give us an individual key for each number. So we'd want to make sure that we're counting these, not summing them. And actually I can change the default behavior up here as well. So at the moment it's summary. If I just change that, I can just change that over to count. That should be the default behavior. Okay, so I've gone back to the visual view and I can see that all 50 of the SOSA were classified correctly. The various colour, 48 were classified and 2 we had an overlap. And the Virginica we had 46. In fact, I should use different colours really. So we can see 50, 48, 46, they're all fine. But then we can see that these ones have not been correctly classified based on those 2 characteristics alone. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my report. And the final thing that we're now going to go and do is we're going to go back to our query editor and we're going to adjust our data to bring in more information. And the way we do that is we go to transform data. By going into transform data, what we can do is we can adjust the columns of data within our model. So I mentioned before that within here you can do lots of transformations and cleaning. And any of you who have got experience of Power Query within Excel will already know this, but you can now do formulas here within here just to create additional columns of data. And then every time you refresh the data, those columns will automatically be done. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm just going to do a add column. And I'm just going to do a custom column. And the column that I'm going to do is going to be a relatively straightforward formula. So I'm just going to call it area. And I'm just going to take my length and I'm going to times it by my width. So I've got my length by the width. Let's times it by 0.5. So I've got length width times by 0.5 for my area, and you can see now that I've got that additional column of data available to me. So whereas before we only had these columns, we've now got this additional column here on this side, and we can do the same for petal length and width as well. So we can just go custom column. Area. Just get petal length times width times by 0.5, for example. But really, you know, the mathematical formula is a bit irrelevant here. It's just the fact that we can transform and add data in here. This is the point that we're trying to prove. I think the interesting thing that you'll find when you do this is that it won't create the data type for you. So you'll just have to make sure that you click on these dots here and you change them to an appropriate data type. If you import your data as text, Power BI isn't going to be able to sum that data up or do anything of interest with it. So you'll want to make sure that you convert that to a decimal number. And again, let's convert this to a decimal number. So we've now got those 2 additional columns. If we go home and close and apply, we'll now bring in those additional columns into our data. And if we just go down to our data view here on the left hand side, what you'll be able to see is that we now have those 2 additional columns within our data. Actually, there's multiple ways of adding a new column within Power BI. I could try and add a new column here as well. And that will use something called programming language called DAX. But generally, you want to avoid doing any kind of data adding of new columns in DAX unless you have to. You generally want to do it as high up the stage as possible. Okay, and even better if you could do it in your original data rather than do it within the query editor. Okay, so the final thing that I just want to show you is at the moment we're using what's known as an implicit measure rather than an explicit measure. And what that means is we've just dragged and dropped our observations, and we're kind of allowing Power BI to kind of come up with it. It's not clear what it's necessarily doing, but you can create a explicit measure which you can then use within your model. And again, this uses what's known as DAX to create it, which is the program DAX, dynamic expressions. And if you click on new measure up here, we can create a new measure. And if we call that number of observations, and I'm just going to make this a bit bigger so you can actually see it. So I'm just going to click this down arrow, highlight it, and I'm just going to make that a bit bigger just so you can all see it. Now, with my number of observations, I'm now going to put an equal sign, which is going to start my formula. Now, I could count the number of observations, which is absolutely fine. However, there's a more efficient method, which is if we use count rows, and that will just count the rows of data within the iris data. And we know that each of the 150 rows responds to a record. And this is pretty standard. Count rows is a very useful way of doing it. And hopefully you can see down here on the right hand side, we've now got this kind of calculation surrounding our measure, and the rest of them don't have a calculation, so they're just standard. The only one that's not standard here is this observation clusters, and that's because that's the group that we created when we tried to get our data model to classify our data. So if we take our number of observations and we drop that within our values, you now see it works exactly the same. However, it's a lot clearer to the user, and it's a lot clearer what you're doing. And if you use explicit measures, you'll find that you won't get yourself in trouble with what exactly is this doing. Okay, so that's everything I wanted to kind of run you through. Hopefully you can open the desktop and hopefully you've been able to follow along with some of that. And what I'll do is I'll just open up the chat for questions. Emma, I don't know if there's any questions already that have come through.
Yeah, a couple of questions have come through. So I guess we'll start from the beginning. So someone posted that there was no Power BI for Mac. Was there maybe a workaround for that?
Yeah, there are some workarounds, but no, Power BI is inherently Microsoft Windows-based product. So yeah, it is one of those things where you know, if you think Microsoft have got Microsoft Office and Microsoft, and it's all hosted. So yeah, no, for Mac it is not available. But there are workarounds that you can put a Windows installation on your Mac, but it is a bit of a workaround.
Okay, great. Move on to the next question. Hi, how can we bring very large data sets into Power BI, say a couple of millions or even larger?
Yeah, so I mean, a couple of million you're not going to struggle with. When you start getting up to 20, 30 million, you can then start to struggle with. But there's various ways to bring in very large data sets. Generally, if you're bringing in a large data set, you're not going to be bringing it in from a CSV file. You might be, but usually when you're dealing with large volumes of data, you're dealing with things such as APIs, which are kind of online kind of ways of accessing data, or you're dealing with something SQL databases is one of the most common. And what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to bring in those data. So you just be able to go more, and you'll just follow the same procedures that we've already followed. And there's something within Power BI which, when you start operating with those very large data, especially when you do it with SQL, it will do something called query folding. So it will push any transformations that you do back to the source. So if you're using a fast database like a SQL for a few million rows, it will be really quick. And the final thing is there's something called incremental refresh. So if you load in 10 million rows of data and you get next week's data, you don't want to load in 11 million rows of data, you just want it to load in that extra 1 million, and you can get Power BI just to refresh for that 1 million for you each time through. Hopefully that's comprehensive enough.
Brilliant, thanks, Chris.
Yeah.
A couple from Hamad. So first one is there an online version of Power BI or just as Office 365?
Yeah, so the Power BI desktop version is it's kind of the desktop-based version, obviously. And what you do from here is you then publish your data set up to the cloud. So I'm not going to do it in this instance, but if you go publish, you need a pro license to publish it up to anything apart from my workspace. But once you publish it up into the cloud, what happens is your users, I think I've got it open here. Here we go. So this is now the online version. Your users can now interact with it online. So this is what it then looks like within the cloud. So yes, there is, but you build and you make your report in desktop and then you publish it up to the cloud for people to consume it. The only other thing there is there's the mobile version, which I haven't shown you. So if you go to, there's a mobile version as well that you can go. So if you go view, you've got a mobile layout as well, and that will mean that you've got the online version, and then you can also design your mobile version here as well. Finally, hopefully that answers the question, Hamed.
That's great. There are a couple more. I'm not sure if you want to go through them now or come back to them.
Yeah, I mean, that was everything I wanted to kind of show people today. I'm kind of hoping that everybody can open up the Power BI desktop and start kind of playing with the data and actually start transforming and doing their own kind of reporting. And then ask any questions that they've kind of problems that you've run into. So if you can follow through the steps that I've got, I have put within the notes as well, there is the Iris Lab PDF, which gives you a step-by-step if you've missed anything that we've discussed. And then I'll continue going through the questions if that's all right while people are doing that. I can see one question about the original data source. I can't resist that question. So does the data source need to be clean, or even dirty data can also be used? So, I mean, I should go without saying, but generally you want to have your data as clean as possible, and you want to clean your data as close to source as possible. You don't want to be waiting till right at the end to clean out your data, and that's because, you know, quite often data isn't just used just by Power BI, it's used by other applications as well. But one of the things that M is very good at is taking dirty data and cleaning it. And there is so many transformations. I can't kind of go into every single one, but there's loads of different ways you can transform and clean your data. So if I'm back in the query editor, which is where I would clean my data as a rule, here you've got loads of options. So for example, I've got transform here, and what I could do is I can replace values. So if I had some values in here which I knew were incorrect, I could replace them. You know, there's also things like being able to fill down. So if I've got blanks in my data, you can use Power BI to kind of replace that. So that there's lots of different options you can do to clean out your data, but you need to know what steps you need to do to clean it out. You know, you need to be able to get to something that you can use. Hopefully that answers that question. Hi, am I still there?
Yeah,
Hi, yeah.
Still here.
Sorry, just checking. Yeah, so I'm going to continue going through the questions if that's all right. If everybody's kind of open up Power BI desktop and feel through. I know there's lots here for me to answer. So is there a difference in getting data from CSV, Excel and SQL Server? So there is a big difference when it comes to performance. So the most important thing in when you start dealing with millions of rows of data, it's really important that you know, you start using the most efficient method. And actually, there was a really interesting blog by Christopher Webb, who's the program manager at the Microsoft, he did for the Turkish user group last week, where he showed just how slow it can be if you use Excel. CSV is a lot quicker. Excel is one of the slowest, and SQL Server can be really quick because, as I mentioned, if you do steps within the Power Query editor, Power BI will not actually do those steps. So it will do those steps within the SQL Server itself. So it'll write a SQL statement like select X from group by, if you're familiar with SQL. So it'll do all the work on the SQL side, and that's what makes it so much more efficient. Hopefully that answers the question. I know there's an anonymous person said that, so let me know if it hasn't. There's another anonymous question here, which is there a good resource you can recommend to get started with DAX? Yes, there is. Generally perceived, the best resource is SQL BI. I've got no affiliation with them in any way, but I think SQL BI is seen as the gold standard for DAX. Alberto Ferrari and Marco Russo. They have a free online DAX course. So DAX is one of those things, and they always say it's DAX is simple, but it's not easy. And there's quite a lot to DAX that you need to get yourself familiar with if you get more complicated and want to start doing more complex things with it and more complex measurements. So yeah, SQL BI, they've got a free introduction to DAX, which will talk about things about like evaluation contexts are really important within DAX when you get writing more complicated measures. So there's these things called filter context and row context, and they're really critical if you want to make sure that your measures are working, behaving as you expect. Okay, Nicole, is it possible to stop the interaction between some of the visualizations? For example, if you have a summary info, for example, you have a summary info which you don't want to change if you click on a bar, but then other visualizations you do want to change. Yes, Nicole, in fact, it's not only possible to stop interaction, it's possible to change the behavior that you get between visuals. So, and the way you do that, there is a option called edit interactions, and it's in the formatting option here across the top. So if you select format and edit interactions, that then allows you to change your behavior. So if I click edit interactions here to start with, before I showed you, if I highlight a point on this here on the scatter plot, you see that this on the right hand side changes. This is the graphic on the right hand side changes. However, I've now got these options across the top because I've got edit interactions changed, and I can change that. So if I click on this one, highlight, it's conveniently called none, what you'll see is that there should now be no interaction. So even though I've got the point selected, there's no interaction. I can also change it from a cross filtering, highlighting to a filtering. And what that means is they'll only now show that one bar when I select it. There you go. So you can change it on each individual visual. You can also, if you go File here on the left-hand side, you can actually change the options. And within that, you can change the default behavior as well. So you can change it within report settings. So you can go through and change it as well. So, but generally, I would leave it as default and then change the visuals as you see fit. When you publish to the cloud, are you publishing the source data or the method of getting the data? So, yeah, so neither. So when you publish to the cloud, it depends on what you're doing. So if your data already sits within the cloud and you publish to the cloud, all that's going to happen, and that includes if you're using an Excel or CSV that sits on SharePoint, because SharePoint is in the cloud, as is OneDrive. So if you're getting that, all you're doing then is you're allowing Power BI to go in, refresh the data from that source. And the Pro license allows you to refresh up to 8 times a day. If you've got, and some organizations have this, if you have an on-premise SQL server, you're publishing all the data up there, not the whole data set, but just the data that you've imported into your model. And then you need something called a gateway, which then provides you the bridge, which allows it tells your Power BI cloud instance that it needs to go and get the data from a on source, and it allows you to do that. I hope that was comprehensive enough, but you are, when you're using input mode, you are publishing up a subset of the data. But yeah, if you're using on-premise SQL, that's when you need to think about it, and many organizations still are. Is there a way to have Power BI connected with SQL on a real-time basis? I mean, if I enter a new line SQL every minute, my graph in Power BI will be updated straight away. Yes, there is. There's 2 options with this, and I'm just going to have to create a new Power BI file just to show you this, because it's not going to, in fact, actually, no, I'm not going to have to, I can use it. So at the moment, we've used something called import mode. And what that means is that we're importing our data into Power BI. You can actually use, there's 4 connection modes in total. And one of them, if you go through SQL Server, is called, in fact, I did that very, very quickly. Just bear with me. So if I go get data from SQL Server, you'll notice I've got this option called direct query. and that means it's going to directly query the SQL database and get the data. So the data isn't held within Power BI, it's still within the source data. In Power BI allows you to combine direct query with import mode. Generally, I'd advise using import mode. And one of the things that can happen though, if you start dealing with billions of rows of data, sometimes you'll want to use direct query, and then you'll want to use import mode as well. You'll want to use both your import mode for your aggregations and most of your analysis, and then you'll only want to direct query when you go down to the billions of rows of data. Hopefully that answers the question. How can we join multiple data sources? So that is the that really is a lot of the power of Power BI is being able to join multiple data sets together. I think it's quite complicated for me to kind of show you in great depth, but I can give you a kind of an overview, and then I can point you to further sessions. So on the left hand side, I mentioned we've got three different options. We've got report, we've got data, and we've got data modeling. With the data modeling, this is where I would then start to join my different data sets together. So if I was to go and get Excel data set, in fact, if I go get data, I'm just doing this purely for demonstrate purposes. If I go get data, text CSV, and I click on my Iris data set again, this could be another data set. I'm just choosing the Iris data set because I've already got it. I'm just going to go down to transform data here at the bottom. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of all of the data within here. And I'm just going to call it species. So I've just changed the name here on the right hand side. I'm going to remove all the other columns of my data. So with species selected, I've right clicked and then I select remove all other columns. And then I can also right click and I can remove duplicates. When I do that, I've got just those three records called species. So I've got two data, my original and species. I go home, close and apply that. I'm now going to get that second table appear within my model. That's just going to load that in, and automatically Power BI has found a relationship between those two. So species and Iris, it's already created a relationship between those two, and that's how you can start to combine data. I'm doing a two-part series on this, data modeling from single table to star schema. It might seem a little bit daunting if you've not done any data modeling before. I will be trying to explain it in as simple a language as possible, but really this is the super powerful. If you're good at data modeling within Power BI, then you're good at Power BI, in my opinion. I know I probably disagree, but I think it's the most important topic. I've got the 2020 version. Is the clustering feature? No, the clustering feature came out before that version. However, I would always recommend having the latest version of Power BI. Yes. So Rich, no, it should be there. Can you please paste the link? It should be right at the top, Ahmed. Paste the link for, is that the link for the session? I'm doing it in two parts, so there's a few I haven't actually announced. That's the link to the data modeling. Does each user on the web need a license to view the reports, or is it just a producer that needs them? So there's when it comes to licensing, there's a few different options. The first option is if everybody needs a pro license, a Power BI Pro license. I can't remember what the price of that Pro license is. It's about $10 a month. And what you will do is you'll publish that to a workspace, and both the user and who produces it, they both need a Pro license in order to access it. The other option is something called Power BI Premium, and in that instance you pay for the space, and you can have as many users as possible consuming that. So yeah, there's some detailed documentation on licensing. You can go two different ways really, two different main ways. Can you explain a bit about the drill down feature? Can you drill down to another graph, another dashboard? Yes, you can. So drilling, so I think there's a little bit of terminology we need to be careful with here. dashboard is different from a report in Power BI, and drilling across reports is quite a complicated thing to set up. Well, it's not that complicated, but it's a bit more complicated. Within the same report, it's relatively straightforward. So if you're thinking about your drilling across reports, it gets a bit more complicated, but you can drill down into your data. So if I go to, I'm just going to have a new page here just to show you a nice simple way of doing it. How are we going to do this? So if I did, okay, it's not a great example, but I'm going to, with the limited data I've got, I'm going to show you. So I'm just going to put the species page. So I've got a graph here, which is a clustered column chart. I've got species on the axis. I'm going to put species on the axis below. So I've got species and species, and I'm going to put number of observations on the values. Okay, so we've got 50 observations for all of them. Now what I can do is I can drill down to the next level of the hierarchy using these 3 dots, or I can expand it out. So you'll see here, we've got them, and then when I hit that expand out, we've got it repeated because I'm using species and species as both 1 and 2. So you can use that to drill across to another visual. You can use a right click to drill across to another visual. So when I've got this selected, I could then drill across to another visual, and you can use tooltips as well. So I could hover over this and it could show me a tooltip on another page. Probably not time for me to go into that today, but I'm happy to point you at the resources. Let's show you that. How do you connect Power BI? Hopefully, Lorna, yeah, okay, great. I'm happy to point you in the direction of the resources. How do you connect Power BI to the Common Data Service? Okay, and how do you use Power BI to compare 2 data sets, one from CDS? Yeah, you can do both of those, anonymous, and it's relatively straightforward. So if you go to Get Data, here again, it's within one of the More options. So you'll need Get Data and then More. And then you can just search for any data set. So in the instance you asked for, you're asking for the Common Data Service. I've just typed that in there and I've got the Common Data Service. So I could do that, and I could also do another connection, which was getting it from SQL, and I could bring in both of those data sets separately. So yeah, so if you ever want to know about whether a data set is supported or not, just try it. Just open up More, type in what you're after, have a look for it. You'd be amazed at the amount of connectors that there are available. There's just so many different ways and different sources of data you can connect to. Great. Well, I think it'll be a world first. I finished all the questions with 3 minutes remaining, Emma.
Yeah, thank you so much. You've done a great job of answering them, and there's been some really great questions that have come through. So thanks so much, everyone, for being so engaged and asking all of your questions. And I think we've a couple more coming through if we've time for. Hannah's just asking about the link that was about the question on DAX, and if that link is available.
I got this question. I did an earlier community event at 1 to 2 earlier today, and I got the same question. So
okay.
They need to start giving me royalties.
Yeah.
You don't want to do mastering DAX. That'll blow your mind if you've never come across it. So do the there's an intro to DAX. Actually, there's a data modeling one as well, which is great. But there's the free one is introduction to DAX. Don't start with the mastering to DAX. It's too crazy. I'll put it in there. SQL BI. Those are the gurus.
Great.
Great.
Thanks so much for getting around to all of that and for a great session as well. And I'm sure that everyone who's joined today has found it really valuable too. I just wanted to share a quick slide before we end. Would that be okay for me to share now, Chris?
Yeah, go for it. Thank you so much for having me on, Emma, and thank you everybody. I just want to turn my camera and say hello.
Oh,
thank you.
Absolutely, that's fine. So if it's sharing now. Share. So I did mention at the very beginning of the session that we have a short survey that we would really appreciate any feedback on from today's session. We really want to make sure if there are areas to improve on from an attendee perspective, that we're definitely doing that. So the link to the survey is up on the screen now, and there is an event code that needs to just be entered at the very beginning of that survey. So it would be greatly appreciated if your feedback was given back to us. And lastly, just wanted to share with you some ways to get involved at the Reactor. So many of you will have joined our meetup group and found this session there. And we are also on Twitter as well. So our handle is on the screen now, MSFT Reactor. As I mentioned at the beginning, we have a YouTube Reactor channel, so most of our online sessions are posted onto that site within about 48 hours of them taking place. So you can go back there and have a look at them. And last but not least, we have a new Reactor Newsletter, which comes out monthly. So you can sign up to that too. The link is on the screen, where you'll get information about all upcoming events and the joining links and all of the information there. So just wanted to share that out too. But thank you so much everyone again for attending. Chris, thank you so much for such a great session. I really hope we have you back again soon. And I think that is it. So thanks very much again and take care everyone.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you everybody. Really appreciate it.